Hi, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate your time today. We're going to get started. This is the latest in our ongoing series of cybersecurity webinars and on DevSecOps. Today's topic is application security and prove it to me. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Frank Yako. Frank is CIO and heads up strategic initiatives for ASMGI. So take it away, Frank.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We have a very exciting topic, and we're going to do a little bit of a different format from some of our previous webinars, where we're going to have to actually have a panelist of experts that are joining me today, and we'll go ahead and get introductions going here in a second. But definitely thank you, and we look forward to an interactive discussion today. So why don't we go ahead and get everybody introduced, starting with Steve Fakis.
Hey, welcome everybody. Steve Fakis here, CTO at ASMGI. Thanks for joining us today. Alex?
Thanks for joining us today. I'm the lead application developer at ASMGI and looking forward to talking some security with all of you today.
And I'm Tim Thompson, senior security consultant here at ASMGI. Thanks for you guys joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. I know we have quite the mind meld here, so look forward to a lively discussion with you guys. And for everyone that's joining us today, feel free to add any questions into your chat box, and we'll do our best to address those in the course of the discussion today. So starting off the conversation, what we wanted to do is just pose a few things for everyone to think about. And again, the concept of application security is pretty broad, and we'll try to hone in on these specific points as we go through. And wanted to make sure that as we start the conversation, we pose some of these questions to everyone. So, first of all, something that seems pretty elusive, and we'll talk about this in more detail, is do you really know all the applications that are used by your organization? And we'll get into some actual details around how to do that and why that's important. Then secondly, if you do know what those applications are, do you actually know how secure those are? Many organizations, have some programs for securing those applications, but if they're custom developed, that might be a different model for how those are secured versus actually, things that are software as a service or even commercially off-the-shelf applications that you purchase from a solution provider. The next point to think about is, do you understand all your application regulatory or compliance requirements? Every business today, has some type of environment that they function within and has some type of, whether it's privacy or compliance requirements that ultimately might dictate how those applications are used within your organization, and also how those vendors that you might rely on meet those requirements as well. And then last point, again, just to kind of keep in the back of your mind is, do you have an actual plan for securing those applications or those critical applications? And again, shouldn't be limited to critical only, but really the applications that your business relies on as an organization. So, what we wanted to do just to kind of kick things off was to really, if you have something when you saw the invite or the email that you received inviting you to join this webinar, if you had any specific points that you wanted to take away from this, please feel free to enter those in the chat box, and we'd like to make sure we incorporate those points into the conversation today. And again, ultimately, we want to make sure we provide value to you as part of this conversation, and that you get the answers or any things that might have driven you to attend today. So appreciate any feedback that you're willing to provide. So as far as objectives and key takeaways, so again, keeping in mind the food for thought questions, we want to make sure that ultimately we provide an update on application security and just what that really means. Provide an introduction to some of the contemporary concepts around application security and defining that. Really getting the point across about why it's important to the business case for application security and why that is so critical to every organization. Talk about some of the options and models for application security, And then ultimately, there's no reason to talk about all these things unless we can actually help you move the needle and provide some type of actionable plan for moving forward and addressing some of the things that might surface or might exist within your organization. So, one of the things, again, everyone's heard this term, software is eating the world. It's interesting, that everything from infrastructure today is either virtualized or is as a code, all the way up to the things that we think of as traditional applications. And those are all things that someone's developing, someone's configuring, someone's using, and has to have some type of attention to it. There's no such thing as any component. We'll talk about the idea of the stack in a few minutes, that you don't have some requirement to make sure that it's being addressed, and there's some security component of that. And again, we'll talk through some of those points. So as we go through the discussions, again, just things to keep in mind. We have a variety of things that we use as organizations to power our businesses, and again, that's changing as we speak. In the past, there might have been a lot of custom or proprietary applications that were developed within an organization. Over time, that shifted from those proprietary applications to things that were commercial off-the-shelf applications that you consumed and that somebody else developed. And then now, obviously, there's a huge trend for moving forward with actual software as a service, where you don't have the responsibility for the development of those, or even in some cases, the underlying infrastructure in most instances. And those are things that, there's a huge push towards that, which we'll talk about also in a little while. As far as the methods of consumption, again, the thought there is that, we think about applications in a variety of ways. From an enterprise perspective, for any organization that tries to standardize on certain business processes or ways to do things like ERPs or HR systems. Also, there's the business specific solutions that exist out there that might be either part of a business division or a specific function within a business. And then there's the actual individual applications that someone might use to use on an individual basis or a work group as well, that they might license and use. And then the big one out there that more and more is becoming an issue is the whole concept of shadow IT. That's where individuals might not want to wait for IT to go and vet an actual solution, and they look at putting a credit card and then ultimately using something that they press the easy button on and can use almost instantaneously in today's world, especially with the SaaS offerings out there. So again, there's a variety of ways that organizations use these to power their businesses, and these are just a few of those methods. Also like to then transition a little bit to where the data resides. And I'm going to ask Steve Fakis maybe just to kind of talk through what some of those different ways are where data resides and how important it is to be aware of those things.
Right. Absolutely. Thanks, Frank. So, yeah, and I mean, as you can see on screen, I mean, maybe stating the obvious, but, just in case, on-premise, servers, and it's, on-premise doesn't need to include just servers. I mean, it's your end user devices, mobile devices, your Internet of Things, within your organization, as well as public, the public cloud. That's Amazon, AWS, SaaS offerings, and things like that. So.
And with and I'll just ask you just a follow-up question on that, Steve. Are there standards on how that data is stored in those various environments? Is it something that's controlled by the end client or the business, or is that something that say in the case of the cloud that's that both. They dictate?
Yeah, both. I mean, both. I mean, the organization themselves have responsibility, but in the case of cloud environments, and I'll use AWS and Azure, to start. Everything's encrypted at rest by default. but that's where their responsibility stops. I mean, so you have a responsibility, for the data yourself. So when you talk about, potentially, standards or anything like that, it only goes to a certain point when you're in a public cloud. When you're on premise, you have 100% responsibility for it and making sure that data is encrypted at rest and transit and what have you. Mobile devices and things like that, it gets a little bit harder, especially if they're not corporate owned devices.
Mhm. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. And then just kind of continuing on regarding the applications that support businesses today, we'll talk again in more detail about, what applications are being used. But, one of the things if you think back to the cross section of applications that are being used, it's more and more difficult for IT to really have an idea of what the actual applications are. And that's something that's extremely important because as we all know, you can't secure or manage something that you don't know about. So it all begins with that. And that's extremely important. The other piece that is important, and especially when you start getting into more and more SaaS-based applications, is to understand how critical each application is to the business. And there's and we'll talk again about this in a few minutes, but the idea of what type of contractual arrangements you might have with a SaaS provider to support the actual application if there is some type of outage or some type of breach or incident. So going back to the concept of business impact analysis, a lot of organizations think about that in terms of disaster recovery, but really as it relates to security and restoration of any type of applications with some type of outage, it's really important to make sure that you have some visibility after you have that asset inventory as to how you stack rank those applications, assess those, and then make sure that you understand, across those different types of applications, how the different services might commit to restoring those to operation, especially if those are critical to you on a going forward basis or as an enterprise. I'm going to just now turn it over to Tim to talk a little bit about some of the factors that also impact application security and also the service providers that might be providing applications. So Tim, if you could maybe comment on a few of these points, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think the compliance piece, as you know, it's a lot of different compliance requirements for different factors in businesses. As far as some of your financial institutions, you have the PCI requirements, you have medical, you have the HIPAA requirements. So there are a lot of different requirements that you have to look out for when you're thinking about your application security and what data that you're processing. And as Steve said earlier, is whether it's encrypted at rest or in transit. And you can use some tools like Qualys to scan your applications to see what, from a PCI standpoint, what the hardware or infrastructure, what it's doing, any vulnerabilities you may have in that. For some of the others, it's a little more difficult to really try to have a tool that will scan it, but pretty much for some of the regulations, they have questionnaires and different avenues of assessments that you can use to really assess your applications for all these different requirements.
All right. And where do regulations come into play? Is that something that's becoming more and more prevalent? I know a lot of people know about GDPR or some of the other things that are being privacy laws that are implemented within the US itself. How are those affecting what's going on from an application perspective?
Well, those are, I mean, it's a lot of regulations. California, the state of California, the state of New York, both have their regulations that they're requiring for a lot of companies to adhere to. So you get those regulations either statewide or, like I said, business type of business wise as well.
All right. And then as a result of that, really, ultimately, it's the organization's responsibility to understand, based on where they do business, what those requirements are, and what might be required as far as compliance to those either compliance requirements or regulations, or maybe they're part of an industry that dictates certain standards that also have to be followed. The other thing is on the contractual commitments. Again, this goes back to understanding who your customers are, and if you have certain commitments that have to be made, whether that's through audits or also through any type of even restoration times, those also have to be converted into what those service providers or the solution providers are providing you as well. So that's just something else to be aware of. And then the last point on this slide is regarding open source software. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail, but it's definitely something that's a major factor in any software solutions today, and how prevalent that is. So we'll get into a little bit more detail on that. I'd like to just shift gears, or we'll shift gears a little bit to also talk, kind of go along with some of the points that Tim was making. Alex, if you could maybe just talk about some of these standards and why it's important to understand what some of the security requirements are surrounding those, based on again, how it ties back to the business that you might be in.
Sure. So dependent upon the industry or business that you conduct, you are to adhere to some of these different standards, whether it's healthcare and HIPAA. Pretty much everyone that's processing payments with PCI, they each have their different expectations for how often you're going to be scanning and actually going after vulnerabilities, whether they're application side or infrastructure. You can see up the top, the ISO is recommending quarterly, externally and internal scans. While these are recommendations, we also would advise to make it more of an ongoing practice and not just a one-off. We would like to see these be a standard practice that you participate in ongoing and not have it as a one-off, but we will dive more into that in a bit.
All right, great, thank you. And ultimately, again, don't want to keep repeating ourselves, but the buck really stops with the entity that's consuming these applications. It's not something that could be passed off to the solution provider. So that's the one thing that's very important to keep in mind. So another related point on all this is and again, a lot of this crosses across or affects all the types of applications that are out there. These are some of the different types of agreements and reporting requirements that might be in place for a particular type of solution. So again, if you think about the end user license agreements as well as the service agreements, those have specific requirements of what that solution provider is signing up for, relative to the support of those applications. And then that's something that, it's not just usually something that legal would review, but it's something that IT and security should be very aware of, because it does impact your relationship that you have with that particular entity. And again, when we talk about, especially with SaaS applications, these are the things that the devil's in the details as it relates to understanding those specific requirements or clauses within an agreement and making sure that those meet your business needs. That's not something that an attorney or even someone from a business perspective would translate how that could affect the actual business. And then on the SOC report side, we're not going to dig into all the details on what those are, but maybe Steve, if you could just maybe comment on sort of why those are important and what an entity, why it's important to have those from an entity, depending on the actual type of organization that's providing solutions to you.
Yeah, and I apologize, Frank, my audio cut out just briefly. We're talking about the SOC reports, is that correct?
That's correct, and just kind of what the role of those are and why those are important.
Yeah. And the SOC reports are important from a controls perspective. Just for anybody who's not familiar with the SOC or a SOC audit and the SOC reports themselves. They provide a mechanism of audit to confirm that that an organization is, it has all the security controls and, mechanisms in place, and not just in place, that they've been tested and validated, I mean, that's really it. It's just, the key thing here is just to make sure that they exist. And not only that they exist, that they've been tested. And that's what the purpose of the audit and the auditor's job is, during any one of those SOC audits. We could, spend a whole webinar on the different types of SOC audits themselves, 1, 2, and 3. Most people, most organizations are, probably focusing on the SOC 2, the security type audits, the IT security and IT security controls audits.
So as it relates to, say, if some of the participants in today's webinar were providing a solution to entities, they might be required to provide a SOC 2 report to the customers that they're delivering their solutions to. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I mean, a perfect example of that would be like, Azure or AWS. They make their SOC 2 audits, readily available to be reviewed, so everybody can see that they've got the controls and security controls and mechanisms in place, and that they've been tested, to secure the infrastructure that your applications and data and everything else resides in. So.
Okay. And then another piece of that, which actually ties into the consumer of that solution, but also it's important for the provider of that solution to understand, is the complementary user entity controls, because going back to the conversation that we had about where the responsibilities lie with the platform provider, that could be a series of expectations or requirements for an end user as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. The complementary user entity controls, are a list of things that are actually the customer's responsibility within the audit itself. So while you may review, Microsoft's Azure SOC audit, you'll see that the user entity controls are things that the customer is specifically required to do, and that's things around who you've granted admin access to, and that you validated and confirmed that they still exist within your organization. Simple things like that. So it's extremely important to, at a minimum, if you browse over everything else in a SOC 2 report that a vendor supplies, is to check out the complementary user entity controls, because those are things that affect you, and that you have a responsibility for. And by you, I mean the organization that's consuming that service.
Right. Great. Thanks for that clarification. Another piece of this is, as we go further, into as everyone is aware, we've had some supply chain attacks or incidents over the recent past, and that's where the whole concept of third-party risk management comes into play. So another piece that we have Tim Thompson, that's extremely familiar with third-party risk management and doing assessments. Tim, could you just kind of talk about why that's important as part of a software solution provider, and how that plays into again, understanding the security of an application?
Yeah, well, a lot of times with third-party risks, people think of the financial aspect of that, but also from a reputation standpoint, you can really, if a application causes a problem for your company based on what a third party's done with that application, that looks at your reputation and can really affect future sales for your company, as well as what people really think of your company. So it's very important when you're looking at your third parties that you may be getting applications from, that you really vet them through your contracts, as well as through an assessment. Make sure you do your due diligence on those third parties.
All right, great, thank you. And then the last point there is regarding security ratings. So we're actually, not to put a plug in, but we're actually having another webinar next week as part of our webinar series on security ratings. And if anyone's not familiar with that, that's similar to the credit rating agencies, where there's actual security ratings that are associated with the a combination of things, but the best way to describe it is just that comparison to credit ratings is, but it is regarding security. And that's something else that, if you are consuming any type of solution, it's important to understand just what that organization's security profile is. And that can affect a number of things. It could be a symptom of that organization's commitment to security, or potentially what they might be at risk on if they've had some type of incident, which might even correlate back to their security rating. So that's something else. If you're interested, we will definitely dig into that in more detail next week. Just to, again, kind of circle back to, all the context that we were talking about as it relates to those various items. Why does this matter? So, we talked about the fact that there's the custom proprietary software out there, and the migration to the commercial off the shelf, over time. But the reality is, the train's left the station, and SaaS is the way that organizations are going. And this is just one graphic that depicts, across the various types of as a service, what the projected consumption is for 2021. And as you could see, it's projected to grow 23% in this year alone. This does not represent the year-over-year growth, but this is definitely the direction that things are going. And so, all the points that we were making previous to this about the types of things that affect the relationships that you might have with the various entities that provide those solutions, or their commitment to security, is extremely important. And that's really something that it was a little easier in the past when you had things on premise and you could just know what was under IT's control. But as we discussed, that's definitely a different model today. And it's amazing the growth that's occurring in this area, and you can see how competitive it is as well between the likes of AWS, Azure, or Microsoft, Google, as well as other providers in this space. There's no doubt there's money to be made, and solutions that ultimately ride on top of those public cloud platforms that entities want to provide to organizations. So we're gonna so with all that in mind, and the fact that SaaS is becoming more and more prevalent, we're just going to shift gears a little bit more into the details of why that's important. And I'll kind of turn to Alex to maybe highlight some of the points that are on something. We don't want to dwell too much on the statistics, but it's important to really put that all into perspective, and why that's important to deal with these things.
So with the rise of open source application availability, you will find that most applications utilize some sort of open source program. Reason being is it's easier than reinventing the wheel, and these parts of the program have gone through iterations of refinement and are perfect for what you need. So why create it? Why not just include it? And you'll see our statistic here where 98% of code bases contain open source software. That's a staggering number to know that there is a very good chance that your program might use something like Bootstrap or another framework to do layouts. It's very common. And with the continuous releases and updates that go on with this, we see vulnerabilities that are in these third-party pieces of software that you didn't write that were included in your application. And that's why it is very important to be able to take the time to do an inventory of what third-party components you're using, as well as the health of them and what vulnerabilities are currently out there.
All right, and so the point on all this is that it moves the ball forward, to have organizations leverage, or the solution providers leverage all these, but at the same time, there's how many organizations really understand that these even exist within the solutions, or whether those are being maintained. I mean, that's the thing that is probably the most troubling out of all this. There's just like SaaS, we're not going back as it relates to the use of open source, but at the same time, there has to be some understanding of whether those vulnerabilities are existing or not, and what that solution might need to do to address those. Because as I know, Alex, you're very familiar with this, is even if you do need to make a change in one of those components, it could functionally impact an application. Is that correct?
It's very correct. So I can speak to examples where we've gone and updated a component and a class name has changed, which might have been used to set a color on a font. And now you've got white on text on a white background. And we've seen things like that. So just bringing up to a current version isn't always the best practice. Sometimes it's moving it up minimally above where the vulnerability is at. But the good thing is there are tools and there are methods and there are ways we've gone ahead and been able to identify these problems and remediate them as painlessly as possible.
Great, thank you. And then the last point on the bottom there, and I think you touch upon this, is that, you know, one of the other big variables as we talk about SaaS applications is just the idea of testing standards and requirements. And that's something that, you know, we'll get into a little bit more detail about what we recommend to do. But the fact is that there's really not a universal model, even for enterprise level applications that, or you know, like the developing organizations, you know, comply with. And that's something that, again, the responsibility really lies with the consumer of that, to make sure that that you're pressing those providers to get those solutions at the level that you need them to be. So just to kind of continue on the point of you know, how the things have evolved over time, and we'll give a couple of different examples of this, but this is just one other way to represent the as a service model. And as you could see, there's, starting on the left, there's the on premises, and then, you know, a lot of organizations, you know, began to consume infrastructure as a service. That was one of the main methods for migration to the cloud, so that you know, there was the whole concept of lift and shift, and then, you know, offloading the requirements for the hardware of that solution. And then another version of that was the container as a service, which is you know, everyone's heard of Kubernetes and Docker and those types of items. And then we get into some of the other methods for consuming you know, both infrastructure as well as then the shifting of responsibilities ultimately to the right, which is the software as a service methods. And so one of the things that key points on here is that, you know, regardless of you know, which model you're adopting, you know, there's still the same, you know, some things stay the same as it notes on the slide. You know, there's still requirement for doing the development of that solution. There's still requirement for doing the operations, the security, and then the end user support. So one of the things that's really important is to make sure that, depending on which version of the type of service you're consuming and the profile of the solution that you're using, that you understand, you know, tying back even to those that mechanism slides, you know, what those user or complementary user entity controls are, and where your responsibilities are based on the consumption model that's depicted here. And then it's a little bit of fun, but another way to think about this, and as it relates to, you know, some of that same model, is you know, the whole idea of burger as a service. And I know, Steve, we have quite a few good cooks here on the panel today that are seriously into smoking and well, smoking food and also grilling. And, you know, and the thing that I guess probably easiest thing to remember or keep in your mind is, you know, if you have, you know, the best cut of meat and you're ready to eat that, and your grill isn't working because you have, you know, your infrastructure is not very solid, or maybe you have the best, you know, smoker in the world, but you don't have good quality food to cook, you know what the result's going to be. So again, if you correlate that back to the prior slide, you know, you really have to understand, you know, who the responsible entity is on that, and making sure that you know, that does not ultimately affect the end result. So any of one of our esteemed grillers want to comment on that, or any color commentary on that point?
Yeah, I don't know. I might make myself hungry.
You're speechless, huh?
Yeah, so we you know, might make myself extremely hungry if we start talking about cooking food. So.
All right, we'll have a side webinar on grilling and smoking. All right, thanks. So just with all kidding aside, maybe Steve, if you could just kind of talk a little bit more. This gets into a little bit more detail on the shared responsibility model, and this is a depiction of AWS, but it really applies generically somewhat to other entities. Maybe just to kind of break down how these things apply to different entities' responsibilities.
Right. And this is we touched on this earlier in the webinar here as well. That when you're consuming services in Azure or AWS, depending on the type of service that you're consuming. If you're consuming, again, infrastructure as a service, that's hardware, servers, VMs, and what have you. The hardware is the responsibility of the provider. As far as the hardware and underlying infrastructure, everything above that into the OS and everything else is the customer's responsibility. And as you showed off into the previous slides, that the customer's responsibility decreases the further you move up that model into the type of service. So as you make your way all the way up to the SaaS or a software as a service model, but the customer still retains some responsibility no matter which part of the model you're in.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's as simple as configurations and who has access, and what type of data you're storing in that solution or what have you, back down to again, Azure, AWS, and the infrastructure as a service as a VM, where you're the responsibility again within the OS and management, security, configuration, what have you. So
all right,
again,
great.
we could do a whole nother webinar series just on the shared responsibility model itself.
Right, and I actually think we will be in the relatively near future, because that's
it's something that everybody needs to understand for sure.
Right, I totally agree. Thank you. So we did have a question come in, which I will answer in a few minutes. It's related to, if an organization has whatever quantity of applications, does it really need to do an assessment for each of those applications? And we'll talk about that in a couple minutes, and that includes mobile apps as well, because those are just like we've talked about, those are not immune just because it's on a mobile device from all the types of vulnerabilities that we've been talking about. So appreciate the question, and we'll definitely get to that in a couple minutes. So as we mentioned, we don't want to leave you with being aware of what the potential challenges are, and not having some solutions that you could actually take away from this discussion and have an opportunity to apply that. So one of the things we'll just talk through, and again, there's a lot of detail between each or among each of these phases, but then there's again, we'll try to give some description as we go through this on some of the methods for accomplishing these various items. But at a high level, what we wanted to depict with this slide is how an organization could go through the process of where you're at today, and moving forward through addressing the vulnerabilities that might exist within your portfolio. So, the first thing is to understand the actual asset inventory. And I'm going to actually jump to the next slide real quick and let Steve talk about some of the different methods for doing that.
Yeah, and I'll start off the introduction to this slide by just telling everybody on the call or the webinar here that before you can secure all your applications, you need to know what exists within your organization. And it includes not only the custom software, but any common off-the-shelf applications, your SaaS applications. If you as an organization don't definitively know every application that's running in your organization, then you're at risk. I say it again, you're at risk if you don't know. So
no ifs, ands, and buts.
No ifs, ands, or buts. If you don't know an application exists, you can't secure it, you're at risk. So again, I reiterate, you need to get clear on every last application that's within your organization, what it does, what the purpose it serves, and how to harden it to protect your organization. So with that, that's where the asset inventory comes in, and understanding what's in your organization. So there are a number of ways that you can track it. One is as simple as spreadsheets or what have you, and that's probably some one of the legacy approaches. But how do you find out what applications exist with your environment if you're not 100% sure? So if we work from the left of the slide to the right, you can start with, analyzing, firewall traffic to see what kind of traffic you're getting, and then tie that back to the actual applications and the systems they run on. Scanning open network ports, throughout your, environment, doing a manual review of servers and, again, port scans. I've already mentioned spreadsheets, and then IT asset management. And that still requires some manual input and, manual intervention. And a lot of that goes back to the on-premise, and what have you. As you move into the cloud, and, the SaaS environments and what have you, that's when you start getting into CASB, the cloud access security brokers, and depending on the solution that, an organization may have implemented, with a CASB solution, they can not only secure the known applications, they can locate the unknown SaaS applications. So that whole shadow IT and,
Right.
And then, a current modern approach is the secure access, service edge, and the SaaS management platform, and those, like the SaaS management platform, there's three, I don't want to call them components, but there's three parts to it, where it actually does the discovery, to go out and discover what SaaS applications are running, then integrate with those SaaS applications to manage it and then secure it. Again, this whole, I've said this 3 times already. We can do a whole nother series just on asset inventory and how to manage and locate and track and, make sure that an organization knows. Another item that I didn't mention was, if an organization is doing vulnerability scans of their environment, so they're scanning everything within their network. So as far as on-premise applications or applications that they're running in their private or their public cloud, but in the organization's accounts, so the non-SaaS type solutions, vulnerability scans, is another potential tool to help them locate unknown applications so they can get those added to the asset inventory. So.
Great, thank you. And this has changed significantly, obviously, with the the whole pandemic and individuals being remote. That's why we kind of talk about that breadth of things as they've evolved, because the days of having even entity or users going hub and spoke back via VPN have changed significantly as a result of the remote workforce and the pandemic. So that's why it's important to even consider those options on the right as well.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you, Steve. So just to kind of go back to the overall approach. So the next thing, I know we talked about this a little bit, but was doing that business impact analysis and understanding, once you have your inventory, is how those applications are used within your organization, how critical they are, what the uses of those are, where they're actually function within the business, and then going through the process of reviewing that with the business. Once you do that and making sure that you can validate what the use of that is and how critical it is, that's also input to prioritizing the asset inventory, so that again, you understand what your return to operation objectives are and what the plan is if there was some type of issue, how to even go about remediating those if it does have a critical vulnerability. So that first whole phase is really just to do what we would call a current state assessment, and that's to truly get your arms around that. So again, we mentioned the question that came in about understanding whether you have one or multiple applications. Ultimately, the goal is, as Steve mentioned, was to understand every application within your environment, regardless of how small it is, because that could one, have vulnerabilities that you don't have visibility to, as well as could have critical data or information regarding your business that could be at risk if there was some type of compromise of that service that's providing that solution. So that's very important to have that awareness. Again, against that whole portfolio, including mobile devices, because there are many mobile devices that have actual applications running on them that consume data, and if those aren't secure as well, those could be exposing critical information for your organization. The next step in the process is at phase 2. It's really then dealing with what based on the information you had coming out of the assessment, how to actually go about remediating those vulnerabilities. And that's really, the idea of doing some type of initial vulnerability assessment, triaging that assessment, and then developing a get well plan. And I'm going to turn it over to Alex and Tim to talk a little bit about, how we would assess those, those applications, what some of the methods are for doing that. And then ultimately that we would translate that into some type of prioritized plan based on how critical that application is and the findings. So Tim, Alex, if you want to just comment on, some of the methods that we use for triaging or assessing the vulnerabilities, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, I'll start with a couple of them and then hand it over to Tim. But I'd say one thing that we talked about earlier was the SCA scans, or the software composition analysis for their open source components. So this is something that we run against our applications, and we go ahead and see what third-party tools are in there, as well as what vulnerabilities are present. We are also able to see stuff like how mature an exploit is, if there's proof of concept, if it's actually being carried out, or if it's just a theoretical one that's newer in the system. We then are able to go further into the SCA to see what version those vulnerabilities were remediated in, as well as what other versions are available to go up to. So that's the third-party component piece. And then we go and look at what's called a static analysis scan, where we actually take a look at the code itself, and we look for cross-site scripting attacks and all sorts of other vulnerabilities that could be set up there. That's looking at the code itself pre-compiled. So this isn't necessarily something that is readily available to the general public. This isn't something you're able to run on those SaaS applications, although that if they are a SaaS, we would ask that you do your due diligence to contact that company and see what they've done in that regard. And then I would say the next two steps are Tim will cover, which would be adding the dynamic black box scan to it, as well as some penetration testing.
Yeah, so like Alex said, the next step after you compile your code and get it ready to be used, you can do a dynamic application security testing, either using a web application scanning tool such as Qualys or some of the other tools out there. Really to assess, like some of the things we found was old libraries that had vulnerabilities in them that people were using, and some of the other vulnerabilities from a web standpoint. If you have web applications that cross-site scripting and some of those kind of vulnerabilities that would you want to find out before you put your code in production. And actually, you can do some of the dynamic application scan testing prior to your final QA code set up. I mean, through the whole process, you can actually go through and do vulnerability scans. So once you're up and running, what we also would suggest is a penetration test of your application that goes a deeper dive into just the vulnerability scanning, but actually does and imitates what a real hacker would try to do to your application.
With the rate at which things change, I know we talked about some of the frequency of that, but the reality is that if it's something that's extremely critical that your organization relies on, it's more important to have that increased frequency. So the days of doing these types of activities on a just even an annual basis, some organizations just try to check the box on it. That's really leaving yourself exposed. And if you're consuming, those applications either from a SaaS provider or even a commercial off-the-shelf developer or development company, it's important to understand what their commitments are to performing the things that you guys were just describing. So great, thank you.
I'd like to also draw the distinction between monitoring and scanning. And when we scan, it's a one-off, and monitoring is really what everyone should strive for. And that is continuously monitoring the application. Something like an SCA will come up with real-time alerts. Something with your static scan should be done on your code changes and every time a commit is done to your library. And then each time you do a production or a QA push, as Tim would say, then you can go into your dynamic scan every time you compile. But those type of triggering events are what should drive when you're scanning.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and we're not going to have time to get into it today, but just real quickly, another graphic that we like to reference is this one here that is all around DevSecOps and basically shows all the different tools that could be used as part of the overall DevSecOps model, and that more proactive posture in dealing with some type of vulnerability. So again, we have had previous webinars on this topic itself, and please feel free to reference those if you have a interest in deep diving on that. So just to finish out the overall process, so what Tim and Alex were describing was that initial vulnerability assessment. As a result of that, triaging the results, and then developing some type of get well plan. And that could mean a lot of different things as it relates to based on the vulnerabilities that were identified. If there was critical applications that identified significant vulnerabilities, then those obviously need to be prioritized over less critical solutions. But again, it all is based on how critical those vulnerabilities are that were found, and then putting together some type of plan for remediating those as quickly as possible. And that again, this is not just a flip of the light switch type of thing. This can be significant effort based on what the age of the vulnerabilities are and how much impact that has on the actual solution itself, and how frequently used or how pervasive that is within your organization. So again, this could be a multi-month year process, again, depending on what the profile of the organization and how many solutions that are used out there. These are all things, just unfortunately, the phase 1 and 2 are just to get to some type of steady state. That's the good and bad news. Is it seems daunting, but it really is something that's extremely important to go through this process so that you understand where you stand as it relates to the risk to your organization, and then getting to the point where you have some type of visibility and that awareness of what things need to be addressed and how much they could impact your organization. And again, in some cases, that might mean putting pressure on the solution providers that provide those solutions and managing them as part of that remediation process as well. So while that's going on, and all of this is not necessarily serial per se, but that phase 3 is, you don't want to go through all that process and not have some type of going forward model where this is more than a one-time thing. It's, again, as we talked about with the vulnerabilities that surface and how it's important it is to manage those across that whole stack. You have to have some type of going forward plan, and that's really what that phase 3 outlines. We have something that we work with clients on called a maturity assessment model, and as you're probably familiar with other types of maturity models, this is specifically across the DevSecOps cross section of an organization, which is, again, what we believe the model that you should be operating all your solutions. But the goal there is to get to a point where you understand, how mature your organization is, whether you have certain areas that are critical that need to be addressed, and then putting together some type of program and recommendations for adopting or developing that for your organization, the adoption of that, and then transitioning to an ongoing operations model so that you don't get back to the state that you might have found yourself in, at the start of phase 1. So that's so at the highest level, that's really what we would recommend, and we're more than happy to talk about any of these items in more detail if you have any interest in drilling down into some. So we just going to skip ahead. I know we just have a few more minutes. We talked about this asset inventory, referenced the DevSecOps, and really just wanted to open it up to any other questions that might that you might have thought of in the course of the day-to-day. I know that we, these are things that we live, eat, and breathe every day. But I'll just, let's see if we have a few questions that have come in. So I'll just pose one to Alex, and specifically as it relates to the whole concept of, I know this is a detail, but continuous delivery and enhancements to applications. Is it, the question is that something that impacts the profile or the security of an application if someone's using applications that have adopted that kind of model?
Yeah, we love CDCI. We use it. So along the continuous development and continuous integration, we have quality gates and we have our programs woven in. So like I had mentioned before, if we get a ticket that comes through and we need to make a change, we do the change, we commit the code. The moment that code is committed, the static scan kicks off. The moment that code is in there, SCA goes and starts looking to see if any of the third-party resources need to be updated. And then we're able to go through and take a look at that. We use quality gates along the way where we deploy to each of the different production servers. So if it's, dev, if it's QA or production, along the way, we actually have manual reviews as well as making sure that we pass those checkpoints with the SCA and the static scans before we're allowed to push to the next level. So I hope that kind of answers your question on how we wrap that in.
Yep, thank you. And then to complement that, Tim, from the vulnerability scanning and the DAS piece, how does that typically work then as well?
Well, just like Alex said, once they've gone through and maybe updated some code, and he'll email me, hey, can you run a scan on this code and see if there's any vulnerabilities in that code before we go to even QA sometimes, just to get a handle of what's in that code, any vulnerabilities you may find as well.
Okay, great, thank you. And then one final question that came in, and this goes back to the burger as a service scenario, and I'll pose this to Steve. What are some of the examples of how things like Azure Security Center and also Azure Secure or AWS Security Hub are used to secure infrastructure in the public cloud? How are those typically used?
Yeah, it's a great question. Those are pretty in-depth security tools that are built in. That Microsoft and Amazon have invested heavily in to monitor, but they're used basically they do continuous scans of your environment for security security issues, configuration issues. The simplest example is opening up, having RDP ports on a VM open to the internet. A security center will flag that and real-time report that, close to real-time report that as it's doing its scans of your environment. But they can also do vulnerability scans looking for missing patches, Qualys type vulnerability scans of the environment, as well as any of your PaaS items that aren't necessarily infrastructure as a service, but are the platform as a service, and looking for configuration issues and things like that. So those are used as another tool in your tool set to help make sure that your environment in that particular vendor's cloud is secured. It's in your best interest if you're using Amazon, Azure, or both, to invest some time in getting familiar with both of those tools in each of those environments.
Thank you.
And they're not full-on replacements for other security tools, but they are just another tool to add to your tool set and utilize. So.
All right, great. Thank you. All right, well, I know we're at the top of the hour and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. Just to kind of wrap up the discussion, we also wanted to throw out for attendees of our webinar today or panel discussion some different offers. So if anyone's interested, again, we'll be distributing these slides as a follow-up to and posting them, on our website. But if anyone's interested, we'd like to offer. We talked about the DevSecOps maturity assessment, a consultative session for that. Also, a software composition analysis of one of your applications to look at whether you have any open source vulnerabilities that might exist, or even a DAST or vulnerability scan of one of your applications. And that's also complemented if you're familiar with Gene Kim and some of the different books that he's authored. We'll throw in a book of your choice as well. And last but not least, just wanted to mention, we mentioned earlier about the webinar next week related to security ratings. That's a week from today. And then in 2 weeks from today, we also have a webinar with one of our business partners, Arctic Wolf, and that's to look at the impact of a breach and some of the things that might affect an organization should you be breached. So thank you again for everyone's attendance today. Panelists, it's been a great time having you guys, contributing. I know we've only touched the surface on a number of these topics, but appreciate all of your input and thoughts and expertise in all the different topics we discussed. Thanks everyone, and have a great day. Bye.
Everybody. All right.
Thank you.